Get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is John Marino. I'm a doctoral candidate here in the Education Policy Studies Department at UW-Madison, and I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Joan DeJaeghere. Before I do so, just begin by acknowledging that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, which the Ho-Chunk people have called Dejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Colonialism is an ongoing process. As a department, we recognize and respect the knowledge reflected in the Ho-Chunk's custodianship of Dejope and in their continuing connection to land, water, and community at UW-Madison. We recognize the violence, displacement, and settlement that shape our relations in and with this space. We must therefore, as a department committed to justice, commit ourselves to addressing the intentional erasure of the indigenous peoples in our policies, practices, teaching, and learning, and in our relations to place and with the earth. We encourage all members of the EPS and School of Education community to trace, celebrate, and deepen their own connections to Dejope, and to learn about the histories and present-day stories of the resilient Ho-Chunk presence and relationships that shape Dejope. With that, I'd like to again welcome Dr. Joan DeJaeghere. Dr. DeJaeghere is professor and current chair of the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development at the University of Minnesota. Engaging critical feminist and capabilities lenses, her work focuses on gender equity, youth livelihoods, and collaborative knowledge production and use in international education. She's an internationally regarded scholar in the field of comparative and international education, having won numerous awards and having previously served on the board of the Comparative and International Education Society. So needless to say, I and so many of us are really excited to have you with us today, Dr. DeJaeghere, and we look forward to your talk. I think with that, I can turn it over to you. And if you have the power to move the slides and everything, we should be good to go.
Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon or evening, wherever you are situated. And thank you, Jonathan, for that wonderful introduction and for the acknowledgement regarding the University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin. I come from the University of Minnesota, and I too want to acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral and current lands of the Dakota people. And while it's important to acknowledge the peoples whose lands we live, learn, and work on as we seek to improve and strengthen our relationships with our tribal nations, we also need to acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institutions provide support and resources and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And with that acknowledgement, I want to particularly point to a key idea that I hope you all will take from this talk today, which is the importance of engaging in different ways of knowing, whether that resides in the academy or outside of the academy. So my talk today is primarily about, or draws on my recent book, Reflexive Mixed Methods Research in Comparative and International Education, and a recent article that was also published in CER, Comparative Education Review. But I want to, like I said, highlight particular aspects of this book as really addressing sort of pluralistic ways of knowing and ways to try and engage with that across different disciplines or being transdisciplinary. So with that, I want to get started with my talk to basically with this sort of outline to the presentation, which is first, why is mixed methods research important in comparative and international education? How can we do it reflexively? And how can reflexive mixed methods help produce relevant and just knowledge? And I should say that I start from the pretense that there's a lot of mixed methods research being done in comparative and international education. Some of that, I think, could be done better, and I think it requires more reflexivity. But it also starts from the acknowledgement that in our field, we need to be able to think or to produce more knowledge that is actually relevant and just, and not reproducing some of the ways that our knowledge has already silenced other kinds of knowledges or framed our world in dominant ways and ways of being and thinking. So with that brief outline of the presentation, I want to share with you just briefly how I came to this topic, because as I was telling a couple of colleagues as we started this conversation, I wouldn't have called it, when I was doing my doctoral studies, I would not have said that I was a mixed methods researcher. I think it takes a lot of courage and time to engage in this space. But I did set some of the groundwork for doing mixed methods research, particularly both out of my prior academic studies, but also a lot of my other kinds of experiences. So some of those academic studies that I lean into a bit now in trying to think about mixed methods research and doing it in transdisciplinary ways are that I initially studied political science as an undergraduate, political science and Spanish. And then in my graduate work, I focused more on psychological science, education psychology, and I did some social science studies as well. And then eventually for my PhD, I was in the comparative and international education program. So it was through these different ways of knowing that I saw that we frame our knowledge production differently, that we, sorry about that. Somehow it decided to automatically move. That we frame our knowledge production differently, and that at the same time, there's a need for greater engagement across these disciplines to be able to talk about the applied field of education, and particularly comparative education. And then I would say over the last 15 to 20 years, I have been leading several research teams that have been multidisciplinary, as well as worked in many different country contexts. And so I will be talking about a couple of those research team experiences and how it helped me think about mixed methods research through different lenses, and how maybe there's still some dominant or common ways that we do mixed methods research, but how we might actually do that with more reflexivity. So why do we need mixed methods research, particularly in comparative and international education? And I would argue, as I said already, that we already do a lot of mixed methods research in our field. It is an interdisciplinary field. But there's ways to do that, I think, differently. So CIE scholars have long asked questions about the complex nature of education systems and the interactions that happen in those systems, all the way from the level of the classroom with the teacher engaging with students, to school environments, to what are the community and regional kind of policy impacts on different schools, to the national level with national curriculum or national policies and guidelines, to the international level. And this is, a complex set of interactions that happen and affect education systems, and thus the questions that we're asking. We also know that CIE is situated in, as I said, many different disciplines and ways of knowing, and there's long been a call for epistemological pluralism in our field. And I think it's just the question of how do we do this, right? How are we doing it? How could we do it better to actually explain these complex systems and interactions that are happening? The other point I think is important for us in considering mixed methods research is that education systems and the processes of learning, right, for young people or for anybody from child on up to adult, really must account for past, present, and future, or the temporality of that process. So in the introduction, Jonathan talked about, the impact of colonialism on our education system. So we need to be able to understand the past and how it affects our present, and how the present affects our future when we're thinking about futures of education. But we also need to look at the temporality for individual learning processes and community learning processes. So temporality is another component, I think, that we need to account for when we're thinking about mixed methods research. And finally, I think that we in comparative and international education are trying to offer explanations that are contextualized in place and space. And this is the work actually of Leslie Bartlett, who, thank you for inviting me to give this talk, Leslie, and for others, Fran Bradvers and others who've written about the importance of contextualizing our work at different layers of place and space in comparative education. So this, I think, lays out some reason of why mixed methods is already occurring and how we have to think about it in new ways to be able to respond to these notions of complexity, epistemic pluralism, temporality, and place and space. So as I said, mixed methods is already being used, and there are more common approaches to mixed methods research, and there are others I think that are important for us to be thinking about in terms of how can we do this better, how can we do it more reflexively. And in the book, I lay out in chapter 2 this table. I realize there's a lot of information on this table, but I want to just point out a couple of key points for this talk today. And that is that pragmatism is the common approach to doing mixed methods research, right? Pragmatism is a way of trying to acknowledge that there may be different ideas of reality, as well as different epistemologies of how we know it, but that we try to ask different questions and we bring these different paradigms together to be able to ask those questions. And this is, as I said, in most common textbooks from Tasha Corey and Ted Lee to others who've written about mixed methods, this is sort of a dominant orientation in the field, particularly in the education or education sciences. There are, of course, other paradigms used in mixed methods research that have become also discussed at length, but a couple of these used a little less so. So constructionism is sort of a response to some of the pragmatic approaches in mixed methods research, where it was really a response to saying, okay, we might be pragmatic in bringing different ontologies and epistemologies together to answer questions, but often still the dominant ontology is one that uses quantitative data, right? And the constructionist approach is trying to suggest that all human experience is interpreted and we make sense of it, even if we have sort of quantitative data or qualitative data. So there are, in the mixed methods research kind of literature, some orientation to framing mixed methods research from a paradigm of constructionism. And then more recently in the mixed methods research, there's this discussion about dialectic pluralism, which does try to acknowledge again that there's sort of different notions of reality, and there may be different ways of understanding that reality, but we need to sort of put those understandings of reality into dialectic relationship to understand how to produce new knowledge. And then I suggest that the other area that has more recently influenced mixed methods research is critical realism. And I have much more to say about this in the book, and I'll only say a little bit about it in this talk today. But critical realism comes from a notion that reality is actually stratified, that there are layers of reality that are real, that we can observe and know. And there are also layers of reality that are always interpreted and or constructed in our ways of knowing. And so through critical realist perspectives, the idea is to try and bring those paradigms together by using our different forms of data, different methods, and to bring those together to offer more of a contingent explanation of this sort of layered reality, if you will. So I want to lay out those different approaches to mixed methods because as I talk through a couple of my examples that I, in my experience in leading mixed methods research projects and teams, you will see how these different paradigms are influencing the processes of mixed methods in the examples that I'm going to give. And before I also get started with those examples, I want to just say a few words about reflexivity, because as I suggest here, reflexivity is a way for us to be thinking about how do we bring these different paradigms together differently. And critical realism in its sort of approach also suggests that reflexivity is a necessary component of being able to bring these together, as I would think dialectic pluralism also would argue. And by reflexivity here, I am trying to use a kaleidoscopic orientation to reflexivity, one that involves sort of multiple mirrors and angles rather than a single mirror of reflection on who I am as a researcher. I'm also trying to suggest that reflexivity is about the multiple sort of angles that we need to consider when we look at our overall research process. And that we might do it as a single researcher carrying out mixed methods research, but even as a single researcher, we're doing it in relationship with other people, whether it's our participants or, critical friends that help us to be more reflexive about our research process. And also, obviously, in more transdisciplinary teams, this reflexivity takes place between multiple people and the different sort of ontologies and assumptions that they bring to the research process. So I lay out in the book this sort of kaleidoscopic diagram or metaphor, and this diagram obviously being two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional, but trying to situate the way that we have to be reflexive about our questions and eventually our findings from our research and the use of those findings within sort of this frame of temporality and place and space, but also then being reflexive in this engagement between what is our ontology that we bring to our questions, how does that then reflect back to how we understand time and place in our questions, similarly with things like our relationship with our participants or the kind of data that we use and the analysis that we eventually use. So I suggest that reflexivity needs then to be able to consider these different paradigms and perspectives that shape our questions, but also the time and space, and finally our processes, all of our processes of research analysis, which is a big, I realize it's a big process and a big load to carry, right, as a researcher, but to be thinking about how we can do pieces of this more reflexively throughout our work. And I'll give some examples of this as I go through these cases or contrasting stories that I want to talk about. So two contrasting stories, and I use different elements of these research projects throughout the book in different places. But I want to share with you these two contrasting experiences that I've had and then show you a couple examples of how they produced sort of, or how they engage with mixed methods research, how they utilize different kinds of data and produce different outcomes, if you will. And the first was, both of these are actually 6-year-long research partnerships that I've co-led with researchers. The first was one that was co-led with researchers from the US, UK, the Netherlands, and Vietnam. And it was supported by the UK government as well as the Australian government with a particular question in mind, which was to ask how Vietnam's education system had become successful over a duration of 3 decades. But this was sort of a dominant knowledge sort of orientation. These were what I would call dominant funding institutions, bilateral institutions. They were particularly engaged with economists who were framing some of the initial questions. But the intent by this large research project was the RISE initiative, if some of you may be aware of, was to actually be multidisciplinary and mixed method. So we were to have, and we had a team of political scientists, sociologists, educationists, anthropologists, et cetera, working on this project, including, like I said, researchers both outside of Vietnam and within Vietnam. And so we did, bring in various perspectives and different knowledge cultures, as I will show you, but I think there were often conflicting perspectives on what success even meant. So we were presented with sort of trying to answer a question that eventually some of us tried to trouble. And the second study was also a 6-year-long research project that I co-led. involving a foundation this time with NGOs and us as an academic institution. Again, this involved researchers from many different disciplines, from economics, youth studies, sociology, anthropology, education sciences, etc. And while the foundation had a particular strategy and goals, as did the NGOs, because in this case, they were implementing education and training projects for youth to try and affect their livelihoods, they were also much more flexible and adaptable in producing that knowledge. And in fact, we were asked to always produce knowledge, analyze it, and then reflexively return that knowledge every single year to the NGOs and the foundation to reflect on it and think about what it meant for their learning processes. So without that little contrast set up about these couple of studies, I want to go into a little more detail about each of them. So as I said, case one, the kinds of questions we were asking, as I said, this was supported by RISE, the Research for Improving Systems of Education. We were asked to understand how Vietnam's education system became successful in expanding access, achieving equality, and producing high learning outcomes. And there was already, as I said, a certain notion of what that success meant. In part, it was informed by PISA learning outcomes, because Vietnam had outperformed so many countries compared to others within even their income level, but also within sort of their trajectory of educational development. The other questions we were asking then were, how did policymakers, educators, and schools change education over the past 3 decades? So they asked us to look back to 1986 up to the present to achieve these successes. And sort of, what were the relationships among the different actors and actions and outcomes that help explain this change or success? And if you know, I put in here in this question, my own orientation to it was about a change in their education system and not just a notion of success as if it was predefined. Because we learned very early on when we started this project and we're launching it in Vietnam with our colleagues from various education and research institutions there, that there was clearly debate about what success means. And so that's one of the things we had to keep coming back to. But this, was to be, as I said, a transdisciplinary, or at least an interdisciplinary, project using mixed methods research. It was also multi-sided and longitudinal. And this sort of lays out for you the quantitative kind of orientation to the project as well as the qualitative, and only actually the new data we were collecting. We were also drawing on various data sets that have been collected over time. And I'll talk about those in a little bit when I refer to a couple of the findings. But we had designed a project that would be quantitative in gathering data from 20 different districts across the country, 140 primary schools involving up to 10,000 students through grades 2 through 5 over the 6 years that we worked on this project, 100 secondary schools with another 3,000 plus students between grades 6 and 8. And that includes principal surveys, teacher surveys, student surveys, and assessments, and community surveys, all in these various schools and communities. We also then had an embedded qualitative design to this project as well, where we drew from 10 districts of the 20 that were in the quantitative, 20 schools of the 100 secondary schools. And then we interviewed these principals over 3 years of time using a qualitative interview process. We interviewed teachers using also sort of a reflexive video observation, where we interviewed them before we videotaped them, videotaped their classes, and then did a post-reflection interview through grades 7, 8, and 9. And then we also did observations, obviously through this video observation with students, and some interviews with students at grade 9, and lots of classroom artifacts, and as well as some interviews with national, provincial, and district authorities. So you can see this was a huge project in many ways, and there's only a certain amount of data analysis we've actually been able to accomplish, and quite a lot with a pretty large team of researchers with my colleagues from Venice in the Vietnam National Institute for Education Sciences, as well as a couple of my colleagues from the Netherlands and then the UK as well. This just shows you the 10 sites where we worked qualitatively, but these were all of the same provinces where there were more schools that we did with the quantitative data collection. So I want to just briefly talk about a couple of findings that came out as we did this analysis both over time and then the more questions it actually raised, right? And how were we trying to do this sort of mixed methods, what was supposed to be a mixed methods interdisciplinary study? So a number of my colleagues had looked at, as we were asked to do, look at past data in Vietnam from PISA from 2012 and 2016, but we also used data from the Young Lives Project, which has run for almost 20 years in Vietnam and followed kids from about grades or age 6 or 7 on up into their 20s. And then an analysis using household living standard surveys from Vietnam from various years way back to the 90s and then into the early 2000s and then the later 2000s. And when they analyze and reanalyze all the different data points that they have from these different kind of studies, which included student level data, classroom level data, teacher level data, parent level data, right? And even some district and community level data. Their conclusion was that none of the standard observable variables could explain high learning outcomes in Vietnam. And so this was obviously like, okay, something is not right in all of this data that we are. Something has to explain some of this notion of high learning outcomes. But what is it? What is it that matters that we are not measuring? Or what could not be measured in all of these different kind of data sets that also matters? What alternative hypotheses do we have when we can look at all these variables about what teachers are doing in classrooms, what parents are doing to support their children, what children are doing to learn? What other alternative hypotheses and theories and perspectives can we use to start to imagine other alternatives and other forms of data that we need to have? And as I said, we had already been in the process of thinking about different forms of data we would be gathering through these additional surveys, videotaping, et cetera. The other thing, oops, sorry. If I touch my computer, it seems to change the screen, so I apologize. The other thing that's happened through the course of our gathering our own data, particularly in the primary level or the primary grades, as I said, we gathered data from grade 2 through 5, and we're actually able to compare different cohorts of grade 2 to each other, as well as grade 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, et cetera. And this was my colleagues who analyzed that primary data found that certain classroom practices might have affected cognitive learning, but they couldn't identify the classroom practices that affected non-cognitive learning outcomes until they started to go to some of our video data. And as I said, we collected this video data initially with the intention in mind of analyzing it all qualitatively, which we did, but we also analyzed this data using the TEACH framework from the World Bank. So we actually have some quantitative analysis of our video data and some qualitative. We haven't had time yet to bring those together to try and explore some of the contradictions or possibilities in that data, but I think that it is a rich area because of the ways that we think about, the quantitative TEACH framework is already a sort of interpretations of what are teachers' practices and students' learning outcomes as they analyze that data. So as I said, it raised more questions for us to begin to look at other hypotheses, other patterns. So if there were patterns around what was affecting cognitive learning but not non-cognitive, what other questions could we ask? How could we look at our rich qualitative data as well as some of our quantitative data and either do it differently in our data gathering or do it differently in our analysis? And so what I would say about this particular mixed methods project that was 6 years in length was that really it was many parallel studies. We used different theories. We did have some shared kind of understanding around learning and what was happening in the classroom with teacher practices. As I said, we talked through the sort of underlying theories that inform, say, the TEACH framework versus some of the underlying theories we were using to analyze our videotapes qualitatively. But we didn't actually bring those knowledges together very well. While we did dialogue some, it really was not integrated. And we came up with a lot of explanations from the quantitative data or a lack of explanations. And we also came up with some explanations from the qualitative data. And it's what I would call sort of this lack of integration is more of maybe a bricolage approach, just putting things together where we can. But it doesn't help us really explain what we were supposed to in some ways, which was the complexity of the education system more broadly. broadly. And I think we're still trying to grapple with the pieces of the analysis we've done to try and explain that complexity. Now, again, that was a big ask of us to try and explain complexity of an education system over 3 decades, knowing the many, many policy changes that were also happening. And I haven't even spoken to any of the policy analysis that we did in this project. I want to briefly then move quickly to case 2, which was like I said, another research project that I led in urban, peri-urban, and rural sites in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. This was, again, a longitudinal mixed method study over a 6-year period. And it was to ask these sort of questions. How did an education and training program affect youth's knowledge, skills, and attitudes? So there was this very specific education training program being implemented by various NGOs. And you can see from this first question, in many ways, this was designed to be sort of a short-term pre-post analysis, probably with more quantitative data to assess some knowledge, skills, and attitudes. In many ways, we started with a more pragmatic approach to mixed methods. We had a more quantitative oriented set of questions. And then we had a more qualitative oriented set of questions, where we asked, how did the education system have an enduring effect on youth through time? And what kinds of mediating conditions affected youth through these livelihoods and well-being through time? And it was only probably through time, as we grappled both with the short term and the longer term and the mixing of methods between some of our quantitative data and our qualitative data and our methods, that we grappled, I think, more with our ontology and epistemology that was informing this as we initially designed it versus how we wrote about it much later in our sort of final reports or additional kind of publications, as well as even conversations with our colleagues in this. So you can see this is one diagram of the research design. We've diagrammed it a little differently in other places, but I wanted to share with you that you can see there's a sort of pre-survey that happened and a post-survey before and after these different training programs. The training programs were generally somewhere with a maximum of a year in length, but there had some ongoing components to those training programs. Some of them were more like 6 months in length. And we followed cohorts of young people through these training programs to a point where we had about 2,203 young people for which we had sort of survey data pre and post their training program. And then we followed a subset of these same youth that were coming through the cohorts of the training for 5 years with qualitative longitudinal interviews. And it wasn't only qualitative, actually, I should say, because you can see here, we also did a demographic survey or more quantitative data about some aspects of their education, earning, and savings throughout that 5-year period. So it was in analyzing these data at different points again every year, as well as looking at the comparison of, or the integration of our sort of quantitative survey data that we were asking youth, both prior to the program, but also in the years following, that we were able to kind of think about our findings that we were coming up with and some additional analyses that we needed to do. So some of our initial findings were clearly that youth did increase their knowledge, right, related to different employability sectors. They gained skills in budgeting or gained skills in savings. They also gained some change in sort of skills and attitudes about themselves in terms of setting goals or taking action. But it was a question for us to look at how did those learning of skills at a particular point in time affect their long-term sort of engagement in the kinds of earning or livelihood opportunities that they had. And what we also found from very early on and continuing through 5 years of this data was that their livelihoods were often quite unstable. So we had to really ask ourselves what produced these instabilities in different contexts, and how did their education and training actually affect their earning and savings and eventually well-being over time. And after 5 years, I should say there were many changes, and we've written different pieces about this in various publications, but there were many changes to our survey and interview questions even over time, because there were times that we didn't quite get it right in terms of even asking what earning meant to them, what kind of education meant to them. But in our final analysis, after 5 years of this data, 6 years of engaging with these youth and the NGOs, we came up with some kind of mediating conditions that affected youth livelihood and well-being, and differently in each context, so that we had to try and concretize and contextualize it. And these were some differences affected by gender, the sector in which they worked, the social networks, and financial inclusion. And there's lots, like I said, there's in reports in other places, there's lots of data that could be shared to try and show you how we did these analysis. What I want to basically say about this project was that we took, I think, a different approach to analyzing our findings and integrating our findings, one that was much more spiraling, right? We would come up with data from our quantitative data and our qualitative to kind of produce sort of a description of themes or patterns, descriptions of certain experiences that youth were having. But then we would often have to ask ourselves, what are the different hypotheses that explain these different patterns? So this, I would say, drawing on a more critical realist, which I lay out in the book much more so, critical realist notion of analysis, they would call this abduction, right? Coming up with all these alternative hypotheses and then returning to the data to creatively analyze the different kinds of data that reveal the structures and relationships and effects on these outcomes. And eventually, as they say in critical realism, to come back to concretize and contextualize those findings within very specific places. So even as I said, we came up with these findings across these 3 different sites, they also were contextualized very specifically to what that looked like to have gender affect youth in Kenya versus gender affecting the youth in Uganda, for example. So to conclude, to conclude the sort of how this particular project, I think, was more framed from a reflexive approach to mixed methods research. There was definitely much more dialogue that was critical to understanding and changing what constituted our approach and our ways of knowing. We constantly were pushing at each other to reveal our own assumptions and to think through some of our ways that was influencing our data collection, but also our analysis. We had various contradictions that would come up in the data, especially around the ways that youth were talking about the way that they worked, what the quantitative data showed versus the qualitative. And sometimes we frankly might have gotten some of it wrong by the way we were asking questions. And it meant that we really needed to reflect on and change our methods and analyses. And finally, I think it required us to use many different epistemological tools to be able to offer better explanations. We needed to be able to check our data differently, evaluate it differently, and consider these different alternative hypotheses. So that's just to give you some sense of different approaches used in mixed methods research, one that was much more pragmatic and parallel studies. The other, I think, that really eventually drew on, at least from my own influence in the project, on more of a critical realist ontology and ways of trying to analyze and think through our different paradigmatic approaches. So I want to leave you with just a couple of considerations when we think about using a reflexive approach to mixed methods, and then open it up for questions. When in the last chapter of the book, or second to last chapter of the book, I refer to various ways to think about how mixed methods can help us achieve more relevant and just knowledge, or what I wanted to talk about is sort of epistemic justice. And so I want us to consider how certain assumptions and methods actually include or exclude our key knowledge and key knowledge holders when we're doing a mixed method study. We need to ask ourselves, I think, questions like, how do we remain open to hear and interpret the knowledge of our participants, especially when we come to a mixed method study, whether it's quantitative with particular categories in place, or even qualitative when we still have our particular assumptions that we bring to our analysis. I think it's important for us to consider how different knowers and knowledge are also foregrounded in our analysis. How do we engage in sort of intersubjective understanding and contextualizing of that knowledge, in particular place and space and time? And finally, that we need to consider pluralistic explanations and integrating our findings for, I think, what I call better truth claims in our work in mixed methods. And with that, this is just the chapters of the book that you can see sort of how it is oriented and how I tried to address some aspects today around the reflexive approach, ways that we might need to contextualize mixed methods and our designs. And it goes into different ways using both a pragmatic as well as a constructionist and a critical realist way to analyze and write our MRI sort of research, and then doing that all reflexively with more ethics and sort of orientation to epistemic justice. Thank you so much. I realize that's a lot, leaves open potentially, hopefully, some time for questions and answers or discussion. And with that, do you want me to, I will probably just stop sharing.
Well, great, wonderful, Dr. DeJaeghere for that talk. And we do have some time for questions. We have quite a large group here with us on the chat. So I think I would ask if people do have questions to please post them in the chat, um, which should be open to anyone to contribute to, and then we'll put questions out there on the floor. And thank you for being willing to spend some time in Q&A. At liberty of using my positionality here, I'll throw in the first question. I have a 5-year-old, and she's very engaged in this transition from parallel play to interactive play, you know, where instead of sitting next to a friend and doing something different, starting to do things together. And I was kind of imagining that as you were talking about sort of mixed methods research of parallel versus that which kind of emerges collaboratively. I think one thing I'm not sure how to pose the question clearly, but it's more of a reflection. When encountering sort of mixed methods work, I think one thing I struggle with or encounter a lot is the question sort of constructing variables or categories. You know, and to engage in quantitative work or even qualitative work that's looking at a notion of causality, you really need to isolate, you know, what are these variables of concern? And yet we know that in doing that, we're imposing a lot of our own views of phenomenon on the world, and things are in flux or are varied. You know, for example, a program that compares the impact of a reading program across multiple language groups. And so in that case, language is a variable, but in reality, language itself could be fluid and in flux. And in having to compare across languages, we have to impose a sort of a rigid and objectification on language, which in the lives of people may look and feel somewhat different. Maybe they might not even consider multiple languages different languages, for example. And sort of how, you know, in your mixed methods projects, if as you bring qualitative, quantitative, different types of researchers together, if that sort of process of like, what are even the terms or the variables we're dealing with in this project? How do we sort through maybe different definitions and views that even the researchers themselves hold about what it is they're studying? Maybe I can read off mine and the next two, and then give you some time to respond to any of 3 questions, and then go to a next set after that. It looks like from Rona Brown, we have a question about what conditions weren't there that could help reflexivity to be baked into the example projects from the start? What allowed these dialogic approaches in the second example? And then from Batu, he would love you to please talk about how you align the findings from what funders, government, or other beneficiaries expected or more so with their preferred ways of knowing. Okay. So pause there and let you respond to those different questions.
Yeah, great questions. And maybe I'll start with the last one first because it comes into my, but also I sort of tried to set this up a little bit when I also made a point that the one project was, you know, funded by sort of bilateral donors with also a very specific kind of question in mind, right? Like what made the Vietnamese education system successful, and success to your earlier first question, though, back to kind of constructed as a variable of learning outcomes data, right? And so, whereas the second project, right, was a foundation, which was an NGO still working with, I would think, more on the ground experience and more kind of flexibility. So but they still had their own strategy and goals, and they had their own notion in that case of, what constituted work or a livelihood for young people, right? So, I think some of it is just, even with the first project with Rise, I was often a fish out of water in some cases, right? I went to many, many of these meetings, meaning, and a good majority of them were economists, even though they didn't just want economists leading the projects. But not all economists were necessarily engaged in the same way or posed the questions in the same way, right? But I was a fish out of water because I was willing to also push back against their assumptions, right? Against assumption of success, against some of their assumptions around, that through enough economic analysis, as well as bringing in some mixed methods, we're going to really understand this. And to be fair, I think the people who led that project really were, and I'm very interested in sociological and anthropological and political science explanations, right? But the question became, how do you put that together alongside these explanations that the economists were trying to come up with from the Young Life study, and the Young Life study is a really good example of trying to be a mixed method study with a predominant quantitative orientation in the end, because the qualitative has been really quite subsumed in most countries underneath it, and particularly in the case of Vietnam. So I think we have to be willing to have conversations, push back. And I say, while I was a fish out of water, the people who led Rise and colleagues often said to me, we love the kind of analysis you're bringing to this project. They loved the qualitative analysis we were doing with all the video, as well as interview data, and it allowed some pushback. But, so maybe I can talk a little bit about conditions for reflexivity in that, right? The second question, because I think one of the conditions for reflexivity in our second project, quite frankly, was, well, a couple. One is a lot of face-to-face dialogue. We met every week for 2-hour meetings. I had a large graduate student pool working on this project. And we had a regular class that met alongside. And because so that was one condition, ongoing, really close dialogue. I had regular kind of conversations and dialogue with my team on the RISE project, but it was never at the depth of trying to understand or really push back on our epistemological framing. We did some, and they knew I would push back, and they would push me a bit in our different ways. But again, it wasn't. You need to have people who are going to be willing to say, our analyses are only partial. Our analyses may not actually offer the best explanations. And I think if we recognize that about our own knowledge production, including our qualitative knowledge production at times, that it is only partial, that it isn't sufficient, that we need other forms of data, then we probably are more willing to engage. We're more willing to understand what each of these different perspectives and knowledge, forms of knowledge can bring to the conversation. So yeah, so probably lots of time together, but also the willingness to be able to recognize the partiality of or the partialness, I should say, of our knowledge, not impartiality. So that's one condition. And I guess that speaks a little bit to, the first question around constructing variables or categories and how to come up with explanations, right, around these categories a little bit. As again, and maybe this is my influence as I've come to it over the years, and it's been many years of me even saying and finally putting it down in the text of how I engage with critical realism. But critical realism really would talk about these as sort of that, yes, our knowledge is always only partial, but there is a possibility for explaining contingent causality in place and time. And I would think this point that you brought up around languages and multiple language groups is that we need to be really clear about the categories we're studying, about how place affect that. So place meaning how it also affects different language orientations in place, but also temporality, right? How is language learning even affected by different temporalities of, at different age groups, right? So what does it mean to be a language learner from 5 to 7 even versus 12 to 15? That's one notion of time, right? But also it's about what kind of time do I need to become proficient so that I can show my reading comprehension in this language or a second or multilingual languages. So I think we have to engage more with temporality in thinking about our categories. I mean, education itself is framed by very particular notions of temporality, right? We have grades, we have years, we have notions of what constitutes learning just by these notions of time, when that's probably, in some cases, false, or at least needs to be explored more. I hope that answered partially some of the questions that were brought up, and I'm happy to take some more.
Yeah, it certainly did for me. And we have lots of great questions coming in. Probably won't have time for them all. I did miss Leslie Bartlett's initial question, which I think will be of interest to a lot of us on the call, which is just, what if advice do you have for graduate students who are hoping to become, mixed methods researchers as you look back on your trajectory and experience?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just take that one because I know there are probably a number of you who are graduate students on this. And to be fair, I'm still trying to figure that out with my own graduate students, right? Like how to best support them and help them, because I'm now trying to, although I wasn't able to do it this year because of my other role, but I'm trying to now teach a reflexive mixed methods class in the department, and wanting to make sure that my graduate students get sufficient understanding of paradigms and ontologies and epistemologies first, but also get some introduction to very practical orientation to quantitative methods and practical orientation to qualitative, and then trying to think about what does this mean, right, together. But I would also say, as I think both as a graduate student, but also particularly in this, but even in both of these projects I talked about today, being willing to be open and listen to those who are engaging with, say, a different perspective on even qualitative epistemology versus a different perspective on quantitative epistemology. So engaging with my students who really were strong, like I had a couple graduate students in the second research project who said, I only think really in numbers, right? I really only can think in numbers, right? And then there was always the kind of joke, well, I only can think in words, right? But really being open to understanding how they see the world, how they think that their framing can help contribute to some understanding of some idea we're trying to understand in this complex notion of education systems, right? And really trying to deeply understand the limitations of each each approach, right? So the limitations when we're, understanding what the parameters are. Most quantitative researchers know when we're talking about parameters, what we mean. What kind of parameters are we setting out when we do our different analyses? But not all qualitative researchers understand what they're assuming around parameters, right? So I think we need to be able to engage with that nitty-gritty because those do set up limitations, and they set up what kind of partiality actually in our knowledge production we're claiming from the analysis we're doing from a quantitative. And similarly, I think from a qualitative, right? Engaging in even different ways of knowing qualitatively. I mean, we had so many debates among what my researchers who would broadly call themselves, qualitative, many debates still even among their interpretations of how to analyze the narrative, right? Versus concepts, versus narratives through time, right? Longitudinally. And so there were lots of debates around that too. And I think we can't just say the qualitative researchers, we can't put them in a box too and assume that we all understand that what we mean when we're trying to analyze qualitatively, right? And challenge our notions of particular concepts. So I think it's about being curious, quite frankly, and I talk about that a little bit in the book, is trying to be open and curious, to be willing to engage and not just to critique. We need to be able to critique, but I think we need to critique with enough knowledge of the kind of what are the parameters of that way of knowing, as well as with some empathy, probably, of how it can explain what elements of our real world can these different knowledges explain, what elements can it not, right? What elements of our world are, really are only interpreted and constructed.
Great. We have just a couple of minutes left and lots of good questions, which I hope, since we're recording, I'll be able to save in the chat. I think, what your comment, Supriya's question builds, I think, on where you left off, which is really how we, she describes having her graduate students discuss ontology and epistemology, and how quant researchers and mixed methods researchers, how we can encourage them to also do this type of work, which is often maybe more extensive in the qualitative tradition. And I think some of your comments now just touch on that. Maybe since we have time for perhaps just one more question, maybe you could take a moment. I'll just raise a couple here and then let you choose how you'd like to end the talk. Jungmin Lee asked, what are the potential losses that have occurred, that could have occurred if the study had not gone through mixed methods research, or if mixed methods research had been conducted with researchers from only one discipline? And then a second question, what gains were achieved by conducting mixed methods research with a multidisciplinary team? And what kinds of reflections did this team composition allow? I think that question of losses and gains might be a good place to end. I don't know if you want to take a moment to respond to that.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to everyone. It's hard for me to both concentrate and read your comments in the chat or questions in the chat. So I hope that maybe there's a way to save that chat so I could, because I think some of these questions are important for sort of a revised version of this book. Certainly there are already things that should be done and said differently, or another iteration. I will get to the losses and gains, but I do want to just briefly say we are working on trying to put together a CIS workshop, as well as a potential edited volume that will try to think about how people engage with reflexive mixed methods. And I think that's a space actually where we need some people to talk about the losses and gains. So I would say, I think we would have gotten many things wrong, actually, if we had not used mixed methods. If we had relied particularly only on the quantitative, but vice versa, if we relied only on the qualitative, sometimes we would be groping for like the patterns that we need to try and explain, right? We couldn't always see certain patterns. And even if sometimes those patterns might not have been correct, like might not have been accurately reflected in the quantitative data, it's still like the contradiction between data could have helped us, right? To be able to say, oh, okay, our quantitative data are showing, that youth are working in these ways, but our qualitative data suggests that that work is not in this way, right? And having to make sense of that. So I really do think sometimes we can get things wrong. And we probably need to challenge ourselves more with that. Again, knowing that when I say wrong, I do that within a kind of a critical realist perspective that probably all knowledge is partial, and that only in a given space and time are we actually be able to offer up some explanations. So I hope that by doing mixed methods more, that is actually a gain to be able to offer more complex, even if contingent, explanations. But it takes a lot of work. Like I said, I think in some ways we could probably spend the next decade continuing to analyze and integrate some of our data from RISE. Because I think there are some really important pieces, both from our quantitative and our qualitative, to make sense of. We did this sort of, as I said, quantitative analysis of the certain videos, classroom videos and teaching practices and students, and we did qualitative. And I think if we looked at that together, we would understand teaching and learning differently. And it would potentially, I think, help reshape some of the questions we ask in surveys from now on, like in PISA surveys, or it could also reshape how we undertake even observations qualitatively in our classrooms. So hopefully it's also about shifting some future approaches and methods that we use in our work. And with that, I realize we're over time, but I'm so grateful for all the people who've joined and for seeing so many familiar faces, but also some newer faces, and really appreciate you being here. And I wish it were more in person. I find these sort of online talks quite difficult to do. So I look forward to engaging some of you more in person at another point. Thank you.
Great, and thank you for giving us an extra couple of minutes. So if everyone through the virtual power of Zoom could join me in thanking Dr. DeJaeghere for being with us. And yes, we will save all these great comments in the chat to keep the discussion going. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.